Kate Horner of Friends of the Earth, United States, about what we can expect from the US.
Well, thank you very much. I will try to not be repetitive. I think a lot of the points that I wanted to make have been made already. But on the issue of the United States, to understand what we can expect from the United States here, you have to understand how the United States has in the past engaged in multilateral negotiations. The United States has repeatedly weakened and delayed international negotiations where they don't have domestic legislation in place. The examples abound: indigenous peoples' rights, biosafety, a number of others. The same is true in the climate talks, and it predates the existing concerns about pledging review. We are in this position, of course, because the United States first weakened the Kyoto Protocol and then refused to sign up to it. The compromise was already recognized by the international community, again in this carve-out that was specifically allocated to the United States of comparable action under the LCA track, while the rest of the developed countries would continue to participate in the Kyoto Protocol. And now, again, they are attempting to weaken and delay international action by advocating this weak and ineffective pledge and review system. But the position of the United States in the international climate negotiations is shaped substantially by its failure to secure climate legislation at home. That failure is in turn determined largely by the extremely powerful corporate lobbies at work in the United States, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. But it's absolutely true that the fossil fuel industry and increasingly polarized politics in the United States are damaging its ability to engage productively here in the climate negotiations. A few examples. Of course, the 2010 elections have made a bad situation even worse. Almost all of the senators, the new elected senators, are climate deniers. This is again the same body that would have to ratify a new international agreement. The House of Representatives is under the control of the Republicans and led by the very conservative John Boehner. The evidence of this shift can perhaps be most prominently seen in the repeated, consistent, full-scale attack on the Environmental Protection Agency, which has authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Now recall that in the absence of legislation, the primary means to regulate greenhouse gas emissions sits with this agency. Congress is trying to remove their ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. They're also delaying the implementation of existing regulations on the books. Other examples: President Obama has repeatedly called for a so-called clean energy standard, which includes nuclear, coal, biomass, gas, all at the behest of the powerful corporations operating in those sectors, and at the expense of the communities that would be impacted and are fighting these harmful and very dirty energy proposals. Earlier this year, President Obama also signed off on a project that would open up a huge chunk of federal land to coal mining. It holds an estimated 750 million tons worth of burnable coal. That's the equivalent of opening up 300 new coal-fired power plants. In other words, we're talking about staggering amounts of CO2 emissions. Other political examples: in California, one of the few states to have enacted climate legislation, was under a multi-million-dollar campaign assault by the Koch brothers, which are one of the most powerful corporate actors in the United States. These examples continue across the United States. I think, helpfully and interestingly, many of us have watched with enthusiasm about the Occupy actions that have taken place across the United States. These are a moral response to the massive and growing inequality across the United States, as well as the gross imbalances of both economic and political power between the 1% and the rest of society. And that imbalance of power is the result of decades of misguided ideology that has exalted markets, denigrated the role of government, and maximized the influence of corporate power in the United States. Today, what was once the exclusive domain of the public sector to provide health care, to provide education, to write laws, even to fight wars, has been outsourced to corporations. The financial sector, in particular, has created an outsized role for itself in the United States economy. At its height, the financial sector accounted for around 40% of the United States GDP, a product of its ability to concentrate wealth and make money off of money. And it's become increasingly clear, of course, that the health of Wall Street is not linked to the health and well-being of the people at large. And of course, over the past 2 decades, Wall Street's growing economic power has provided it with great ability to purchase deregulatory favors from Wall Street. Not only has the financial sector been able to deregulate itself, but it's also been able to weave a very powerful and very enticing narrative about the wisdom and superiority of financial markets, which has captured the imagination of the public and the private sector. It's as though the pursuit of self-interest and these markets are not just the basis of our own economic policy, but the answer to social inequality and environmental problems. I talk about the Occupy movements here because the parallels between the message of the Occupy movement and what is happening in the climate talks are very striking. Not only do the developed countries continue to call for deregulating the international climate regime, as has been discussed by my colleagues, but they also continue to advance a narrative that this is the only way to effectively address the climate. We know that that's simply not true. We have an existing Bali action plan that covers 100% of emissions, that will deliver the outcomes that we seek with effective rules for compliance. That is exactly what we lack in the financial markets that cause this problem, and we are poised to recreate that same problem in the climate talks. And I want to talk just a little bit about some of the ways that that same narrative is playing out in these contexts here. Of course, the US continues to act unfairly and aggressively to extort unreasonable concessions from developing countries. As you've heard previously, the United States has proposed a new paradigm of what they call symmetry, modernization, and these voluntary pledges. By calling for symmetry, the United States is attempting to obviate the historical distinction of common but differentiated responsibility. This is the basis of the convention that we are here to implement. They want to obviate their own responsibility for any action. That's true also, of course, for finance. I want to also just mention a little bit more this role of the private sector that Mina highlighted under the GCF. The United States, along with Saudi Arabia, blocked consensus on a draft document coming out of the Cape Town meeting, in part because of the accountability of the COP, but also because of what they viewed as the limited role of the private sector. Already you've heard criticisms that the existing role for the private sector is too great, that the US wanted more. And I want to talk just a little bit more about the implications of that. Private finance, like institutional investors, are viewed as this magic source of leverage for climate finance. So you could have institutional investors raising money by issuing bonds, or the GCF could transfer money directly to them and ask those funds to ensure matching funds. Whether or not they are there to capitalize the GCF or deliver financing, their involvement is likely to require commercial rates of returns. Other investors, like certain pension funds, may require more profit maximization. Now, the consequence of that is that low or non-revenue generating activities are likely to get short shrift. You can imagine that it would be much more likely for them to finance an emerging power fund than they are to resettle climate refugees. There's a very real danger that this will mirror the experience of the International Financial Corporation, the private sector arm of the World Bank. Between 2008 and 2011, over 60% of the financing went to OECD-based multinationals, while less than 13% went to small and medium enterprises in low-income countries. So those very same entities that experience the highest borrowing costs and the greatest credit scarcity are consistently passed over by these kinds of models. We need a new model that is going to access those communities and those countries that are facing dire and extreme impacts from climate change immediately. There also is a real danger of reliance on risky financial instruments that ultimately won't be effective. I think the CDM is an excellent example of how this plays out. A recent study found that only 31% of the total funds went to capitalize mitigation projects in developing countries through the CDM. In forest-based offsets, the analysis is even more extreme. Over 50% of financing is captured by intermediaries. That's according to a couple of studies that are emerging. It's also true of the World Bank readiness budgets in the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. The vast majority, between 50 and 60% of those readiness funds are going to sophisticated, complicated carbon measurement schemes instead of to actually capitalize projects that will deliver emissions reductions. So I say this as some examples of where the U.S. is. What is clear is that the U.S. is attempting to undermine and deregulate the existing climate architecture for the benefit of the wealthy and the corporates in the United States. It's also clear that in no time, in the near to medium future, will the United States be able to ratify a new treaty. So any discussion on the part of the U.S. of a new mandate for a new treaty does two things. One, it delays action that we desperately need immediately and locks in current pledges, and also gives us the real possibility that we won't have any U.S. action and any U.S. participation ultimately. So I'll close by saying we shouldn't be fooled by the U.S. here. We've been here before. We know what they've done, but we have an incredible opportunity now to witness, for example, the devastation wrought by the financial crisis and this emphasis on deregulatory measures, and stop it before it affects the climate talks. We know the impacts of it, because the consequences of this kind of deregulation, as evidenced by the financial crisis and evidenced by the current pledges on the table, will be extreme and dire, and they will be the tipping points that cause us to arrive at a very dangerous and irreversible climate future. Thanks.